The passage that we've heard today, of course, continues the journey through the book of Mark that Leichhardt is on this year. In these early chapters of Mark, Jesus is in the beginnings of his ministry, laying the groundwork of who he is and what he is here to do. So far, he's been baptized by John and anointed by the Spirit of God. He's been tempted by Satan in the wilderness and begun calling his disciples. He's preaching in the synagogues and healing in the streets. He's stirred shock and awe among the Galileans as they crowd to hear him and to be healed. Jesus has been mobbed by so many people eager to see him that he can't even enter towns and has to retreat into the countryside. In chapter 2, as Jesus returns to Capernaum, he's continuing to establish his identity and mission. On multiple occasions, he exercises authority over evil spirits and forgives people of their sins. This is garnering him mixed reactions, especially as he's defied laws and social conventions of the day. He's dined with tax collectors, a class of people so deeply reviled as traitors betraying their fellow Jews, collecting money from them to fund their own oppression at the hands of the Roman Empire, while extorting extra just to enrich themselves. How could Jesus share a meal with such sinners? Understandably, many remained skeptical that Jesus was the Son of God, like many said he was. And that brings us to today's reading. First, people ask him why his disciples aren't fasting like the disciples of the Pharisees and John the Baptist do. Comparing himself to the bridegroom of a wedding, Jesus suggests that while he is among them, it is a time to feast and celebrate the riches of God's kingdom, but adding some ominous foreshadowing that his time among them would come to an end. Jesus then, somewhat abruptly, offers these two sort of confusing metaphors. First, that no one sews a new patch onto old clothing, otherwise the patch pulls away, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And secondly, that no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the skins will burst and the wine is lost. What Jesus is doing here is continuing to explain the purpose of his ministry. Previously, when he dined with sinners and tax collectors, Jesus explained that he had come to call not the righteous, but sinners. Now, as he again defies law and custom, Jesus makes clear that the good news he was here to proclaim requires a whole new way of thinking. Like a new patch on old clothing, the gospel that Jesus had come to share wasn't about something that could just be added on top of the status quo. It wasn't about fine-tuning existing laws and religions or tweaking around the edges. The kingdom of God that Jesus was here to proclaim is something that requires a completely new way of doing things. It requires us to reorder our society from top to bottom, like in Matthew 20:16, when Jesus tells us that the last will be first and the first will be last. The good news of the gospel is like nothing we've ever seen before. Many of us here at Leichhardt have engaged in community organising and the work of the Sydney Alliance. You might have even completed the Alliance's 2-day training at some point. In community organising, you'll often hear about the two worlds dichotomy, the tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be. The world as it is one where money and status command disproportionate power. As Christians, we believe that the kingdom of God represents the world as it should be, a world of peace with justice. When faced with this tension, community organising tends to take a pragmatic approach. We focus on the world as it could be. We form sometimes uncomfortable alliances with people we may not find ourselves in complete agreement with. We focus on improving the status quo, taking steps towards justice, even if we can't win everything we want to. This approach does, of course, serve as a constant source of tension among those of us trying to change the world for the better. It creates tension within our movements, and it can create tension within ourselves. I feel constantly torn about the right thing to do. Am I satisfied with small wins and incremental change, or should I demand nothing short of absolute justice? Do I work within the system that we have and try to push the envelope forward, or do I fight for revolution, abolishing the system entirely to replace it with something new? Do I sew a new patch on an old garment, or do I need a new garment entirely? Like many of you, I still lament the result of last year's Voice referendum. I spent so much time and effort in the lead up to the referendum campaigning for a yes vote. But even among those of us who care deeply about First Nations justice, including First Nations people, there was disagreement about how we should go about it. Do we pursue a voice to Parliament, an imperfect addition to our colonial system of government, or do we refuse anything short of a full treaty and First Nations sovereignty? Let's go back to the reading from Mark and the second of Jesus' metaphors, new wine in old wineskins. As wine ferments, it releases gases and expands. If it's stored in an old, dry, hardened wineskin, the skin will burst. A fresh wineskin is flexible. It can expand with the wine. We can't fit the kingdom of God into our old ways of doing things, into our old ways of thinking. As Paul writes in Romans 12:2, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Of the many interwoven reasons the Voice referendum failed, I believe one of the greatest ones was fear. Too many of us were stuck in our old ways of thinking. It wasn't just that we as Australians couldn't conceive the world as it should be. Our minds were hardened, lacking the flexibility of a new wineskin, unable to even imagine the world as it could be. And Australia voted no. As we move forward to fight for treaty and truth-telling, now more than ever, as a nation, our minds must be soft like new wineskins. Now, I don't think Jesus, in his metaphors, to the people of Galilee, was necessarily trying to give us instructions on political advocacy and what we should demand of others. Because I think more often than not, the Gospels are about challenging us about what we need to demand of ourselves. In Matthew 7, Jesus says, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbour's eye." As I read this passage about patches on garments and wine and wineskins, I feel of Christ asking me, how do I embrace the discomfort of God turning the world upside down? How do I let go of my privilege and share my power with those who have less? How do I embody the world as it should be in my daily life? How do I practice radical, unconditional love and unrelenting generosity? This tension I mentioned earlier among those of us who seek to change the world for the better can sometimes lead us down a road of demanding ideological purity from each other. We might agree on 95% of an issue, but we get bogged down fighting each other over that 5%, making enemies out of each other rather than working together to transform the world for the better. I feel this passage ask me, how do I keep my mind soft and flexible, accommodating to new ideas, rather than digging my heels in to my point of view? But even then, how do I love my enemies, the ones I agree with on only 5% of things, or perhaps nothing at all? As I was preparing this sermon and reflecting on this metaphor of old, dry, hardened wineskins, I was reminded of the work of a Christian artist, the Art of Maza, who produces beautiful Orthodox icons with themes of social justice. In her depictions of the Good Samaritan, she adds a proverb: refusing to harden your heart is a radical act. Refusing to harden your heart is a radical act. If my heart is dried and hardened like an old wineskin, how can I be filled with new wine, the fresh hope, life, and love of Jesus? If my heart is dried and hardened by the tension of the world as it could be and the world as it should be, will I find myself fighting against those who could instead be my allies in the pursuit of justice? If my heart is dried and hardened by the unrelenting injustice of the world, of death, violence, and genocide in Palestine, Sudan, the Congo, and elsewhere, will I lose sight of the hope of the gospel? Whether we're fighting for the world as it could be or should be, the fact that we're fighting for something is the radical act of keeping our hearts soft and pliable, like a new wineskin, open to following where God leads us.